The night Lyra Aldermere was offered to the wolves, the frost on the courtyard stones bloomed like white flowers, and not a single person in the watching crowd knew that the man on the black horse at the gate had already decided he would sooner burn his own crown than see her bleed. They thought he had come for a sacrifice. They thought the white shift they had dressed her in was a shroud. They thought the iron bell that tolled at dawn was tolling for a half-mad kennel girl no one would miss. What they did not know was that Alpha King Cain of the Blackthorn Pack had been riding south for 6 years, looking for a scent he could not name, and that he had recognized it the moment her bare feet touched the dew on the stones, and that the only law in the world strong enough to bind his hands was the one that had brought him here. He sat very still on his horse and watched her walk between the rows of nobles. He did not blink. His warriors, ranged behind him in their gray cloaks, mistook the stillness for hunger. It was not hunger. It was a man counting the steps between himself and a girl he was forbidden to touch until sundown, and praying to gods he had stopped believing in that she remembered how to run. Lyra did not look at him. She looked at the bell, and the bell tower, and the black banner snapping above the gate, and at her stepmother Lady Briar's gloved hands folded in pious satisfaction at the dais. She looked at everything except the king, because she had been told that to meet a blackthorn's eye was to invite the bite, and because she had spent 6 years learning that survival meant keeping your gaze low and your breath quiet. The shift they had dressed her in was thin enough that the wind moved through it like a hand. Her hair, washed and oiled for the first time in a year, hung loose down her back as though she were a bride. She did not feel like a bride. She felt like a deer at the edge of a field, ears tuned for the snap of a twig. A small voice in her head, the voice that had kept her alive in the kennels through 6 winters of being called dangerous and broken and worse, said, "Count the trees and find the wind." The chamberlain read the offering aloud in the old tongue, his voice high and trembling, and Briar smiled the small, careful smile of a woman whose plans were settling into place, like stones in a wall. Lyra did not understand the old tongue. She understood the smile. She had understood that smile since she was 11 years old. On the night her father had clutched at his throat at the long table, and Briar had reached calmly for her wine cup as though nothing were happening, as though Lyra were not standing in the doorway with her mouth open and her hands full of the wildflower she had picked to put on his pillow. No. She had screamed that night. They had called it a fit. They had called her dangerous. They had moved her down to the kennels because, Briar said gently to anyone who would listen, the poor child was calmer with animals, and the animals did not mind her unfortunate moods. The animals had not minded her, that was true. The warhounds, great brindled brutes bred to track rogue wolves through ice and bramble, had loved her with the uncomplicated devotion of creatures who knew when a hand was kind. They had also loved the wounded young wolf she hid beneath the straw on the night her father died, the one she had fed scraps and clean water and the heel of a stolen loaf for 9 nights running, until he could stand on all 4 legs again and slip out under the kennel wall before dawn. She had never told anyone. She had been 11 and grieving and half feral with shock, and the wolf had been the only living thing in the world that had looked at her without flinching. She had not even known he was a shifter. She had thought he was just the wolf. She thought of him now, walking between the rows of nobles with her hands tied loosely at the wrists with a length of white silk that was meant to be cut at the forest's edge as part of the ritual. She thought of him because she was about to be released into a forest full of wolves, and the only kindness she had ever shown any of their kind was a child's kindness, 6 years old and forgotten by everyone who had survived it. She did not know that the wolf had not forgotten. She did not know that the wolf was the man on the black horse at the gate. Cain watched her come and felt the bond he had not let himself name go taut in his chest, like a wire pulled to the edge of breaking. His inner wolf, who had been silent and surly for most of the ride south, was suddenly very awake and very loud. And what it was saying, in the low, certain voice it used only for things that mattered, was hers. 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 And you knew. You always knew. You have been riding for her since you could walk again. Cain closed his eyes for one breath and opened them. He had ridden south expecting a gesture. The southern court of Aldermere had been late on its tributes for 3 years running. The hunt offering was a humiliation, an old custom invoked to remind the lesser houses where the power lay, and he had not expected the southern lords to actually send a living person. He had expected them to weasel out, send a goat dressed in a veil, beg for an extension. He had been ready to laugh and accept the goat. He had not been ready for this. He had not been ready for the girl from the kennels. The girl whose scent had been mapped onto his bones since he was 16 years old and dying in the dark. The girl who had pressed her small, dirty palm against his muzzle and whispered, "Shh, shh, you're safe, I won't tell," while the household tore itself apart above them over the master's body. The chamberlain finished reading. The silk at her wrists was cut. The bell tolled a second time. By the law of the hunt, which was older than any of the kingdoms standing here today, the offering had now been given. The king of Blackthorn, host of the ritual, was bound to the starting line until sundown. He could not enter the forest. He could not call his warriors back. He could not even speak to the offering once the silk was cut, because the law forbade any communication that might guide her, advantage her, or warn her. He could only watch. The 4 warriors who had ridden down with him, the 4 young men of his pack who had come south for their coming-of-age trial, dismounted and stripped to the waist, and rolled their shoulders and grinned at one another the way young men do when they think they are about to do something glorious. They did not know. They did not know what he knew. They saw a girl in a white shift, barefoot, wrists pink from the silk, eyes lowered. They saw an easy hunt and a story to tell. Cain wanted to kill them. He wanted to kill them so badly. His hands shook on the reins, and his inner wolf was a low, rolling growl behind his teeth. And the only thing keeping him on the horse was the knowledge that if he moved, if he so much as dismounted, he would break the law that was the one and only thing protecting her. Because the rest of the law, the part the Southern Court did not know, the part Briar in her clever, poisonous certainty had never bothered to learn, was this. The prey who survived until sundown was declared chosen by the forest. Untouchable, unmarriageable against her will, beyond the reach of any house, any contract, any father, any stepmother, ever again. If Lyra lived until the sun touched the western ridge, no one in any kingdom under the old laws could ever own her, or sell her, or silence her again, including him, especially him. He had to let her run. He had to let his warriors hunt her. He had to sit on this horse and listen to the woods all day, and trust that the girl who had hidden him under straw at 11 years old knew how to outrun wolves at 17. The bell tolled the 3rd time. Lyra lifted her face for the first time and looked, not at him, but at the trees behind him, and her eyes were gray and clear and entirely awake, and Cain realized with a thud beneath his ribs that she was already counting trees, counting wind, counting the distance between the dais and the tree line and the angle of the sun. "Good girl," his wolf said softly. "Good girl. Run." She ran when the silk fell, not before, not after. The instant the white silk slipped past her wrist and pooled at her ankles, she was already in motion, low and quick, angling not toward the obvious gap in the tree line, but toward a denser bramble patch to its left. And Kane knew at once she had been planning her route since the moment they walked her out of the gate. Of course she had. She was the kennel girl. She had been raised among hunting hounds. She had spent 6 years watching deer break for cover, and rabbits double back, and foxes lay false trails through the kitchen yard. She had been studying prey her home life. Behind him, his 4 warriors made the small, surprised noise of men whose hunt had not gone the way they pictured it in the first 3 seconds. And then they were laughing and stretching and pulling off their boots. And Kane wanted to put his fist through each of their throats. The rules of the hunt allowed them 5 minutes grace, 5 minutes for the prey to put distance between themselves and the line. Then the warriors could enter the wood. Then they could shift or not shift by their preference. Then the day belonged to whoever was faster. 5 minutes. King counted them in his teeth. He counted by the swing of the bell rope, which was still trembling from the 3rd toll. He counted by the shape of his own breath. He did not look at the southern court on the dais because he was afraid of what his face would do. He stared at the dark line of the trees where she had vanished, and he made himself sit, and his wolf paced inside him like a thing in a cage. And somewhere very far back in his mind, he was 16 years old again, with his ribs knitting wrong under a fistful of straw, and a small voice was saying, "Shh, shh, you're safe. I won't tell." Lyra ran. The bramble tore her shift along the calf almost at once, and she did not stop. She did not feel the cold. The cold was a courtesy she could not afford. The forest closed over her like a held breath, and she was inside it. And the inside of the forest was not the white and silver theater the courtyard had been. The inside of the forest was loam and pine and the iron tang of old water, and 100 small green smells she could not name. And somewhere far off, a single magpie clattering its alarm. She ran along the bramble until she found the deer track she had been looking for. She had not seen this forest before in her life, but every forest had a deer track, and every deer track went to water, and water meant rocks, and rocks meant scent breaks. She had learned this from the kennel master, old Daryl, before he died of the lung sickness, and Briar replaced him with a man who slept off his ale by noon. Old Daryl had taught her how a hound thinks. "Tell me how a hound thinks, child," he used to say, polishing the long lead leashes by the fire, "and you'll never lose anything, hound or quarry, that doesn't want to be found." She had been 9 years old. She remembered every word. She thought of him now as she ran, his big, knuckled hands and his patient, smoke-roughened voice, and she said inside her own head, "All right, Daryl, all right, all right. Tell me how a wolf thinks." The deer track dipped. She followed it. She did not run in a straight line. Straight lines were for prey that panicked. She ran in long, curving arcs, doubling once at a fallen birch, and then again at a stand of holly, laying her scent thick in one direction, and then her body in another. She kicked through a patch of wild garlic on purpose, hard enough to crush the leaves, because she remembered the hounds in the kennel sneezing and shaking their heads when the cook brought green garlic in from the garden. Maybe wolves were not hounds. Maybe they were not bothered by green garlic at all. But she had nothing else, and any scent confusion was better than none. The forest sloped. She led it. She angled south of the slope, toward the sound of running water that her ears had picked up 2 minutes back, and when she reached the stream, she did not cross it. She stepped into it instead and walked upstream, against the current, for as long as her legs would hold her. The water was so cold it stopped meaning anything after the first step. She felt her toes go from pain to to numb to gone. She kept walking. Behind her, very far behind her now, a long howl rose from the forest's edge and was answered by another and another. The 5 minutes were up. They were coming. She did not stop. She found a flat stone slab where the stream turned, and she stepped out onto it, water streaming from her shift, and she did not let her foot touch the leaf litter at the edge. She jumped from stone to stone, like a child in a game, until she could swing herself onto a low oak branch and pull her wet, scraped, bleeding body up off the ground entirely. She climbed. She climbed until the branch she was standing on was no thicker than her wrist, and her breath was tearing at her lungs. And then she lay down along the branch on her stomach, with her cheek against the bark and her arms wrapped around the wood like a lover, and she made herself stop panting. "Slow it," she told her own ribs. Slow it. Hounds find the breath before they find the body. She had no idea if wolves did the same. She had to gamble. From this branch, 20 feet up, she could see a long way through the bare crowns. She could see, very small in the distance, the line of stones that marked the forest's edge. She could see the dais. She could see, even from here, the king on his black horse, still sitting where she had left him. She could not see his face. But the way he sat, motionless, hands flat on his thighs, head lifted toward the trees, made her think suddenly, and with no reason at all, of a great hound on a leash, tracking a sound only it could hear. She thought, why isn't he hunting me? She thought, why is he just sitting there? She did not have time to think more. The first warrior broke through the brambles below her, and he was not in human shape any longer. She saw the dark gray blur of him, the lowered head, the easy, wrong-jointed lope of a wolf the size of a pony, and she pressed her face against the bark and stopped breathing entirely. He had her scent. Of course he did. She had known he would. The wolf circled the base of her oak twice, snuffling at the leaf litter, and she watched him through the screen of her own hair and thought very calmly, this is the moment. If he looks up, this is the moment. He did not look up. Wolves, like hounds, do not naturally look up. They are made for the ground. The world they read is the world at nose height. Old Daryl had told her that too. A treed quarry is a saved quarry, child, until the dogs learn better, and most never do. The wolf below her snorted, shook his head as if the wild garlic had finally caught up with him, and trotted off downstream, following the false scent she had laid through the crushed leaves. She did not move. She did not move for what felt like an hour and was probably 2 minutes. Then very slowly, she shifted her weight along the branch until she could see in the other direction, and she began to plan the next move. The forest was thicker to the north. The slope rose to a ridge crowned with old standing stones she had glimpsed from the dais. Standing stones meant high ground. High ground meant sightlines. Sightlines meant she could see them coming. She would have to come down out of the tree to get there, and coming down was always worse than going up, because coming down put your scent back on the ground, in a fresh print that could read like a page. She would need another scent break. She thought of the stream, and of the wild garlic, and of the soft moss she had passed on the way up. She thought of her own blood, which was beating along her calf where the bramble had caught her. Blood was useless. Blood was a beacon. She tore a strip from the hem of her shift with her teeth and bound her calf as tight as she could one-handed. The white cloth went red almost at once. She tore another strip. Down by the trunk of the oak, very faintly, she heard a second wolf pad past, this one larger and lighter colored, and she held her breath again until he too was gone. 2 of them then. Maybe all 4 were already in the wood. Maybe more. She could not stay in the tree. The trees would be the first thing they checked once they realized she had broken her trail at the stream. She had perhaps one window. She took it. She came down the oak in a controlled fall, branch to branch, and the moment her feet hit the ground, she was running again, north and uphill, toward the standing stones. Behind her, far down the slope, she heard a wolf cry out in surprise, and another answered, and she knew her false trail had broken, and they were casting about for the real one. She had minutes, maybe seconds. She ran. Down at the line, Kane sat on his horse and listened. The Southern court had begun to disperse, the way crowds disperse when the spectacle is over and the consequence is somebody else's. Lady Briar had been the last to go, lingering long enough to catch his eye with a small, triumphant smile. The kind of smile a woman gives when she has placed a bet she is sure she has already won. He had not returned the smile. He had memorized her face. He had, in fact, done nothing for the past quarter of an hour but sit and listen, because the ritual bound his body but not his ears, and a Blackthorn Alpha's ears were not ordinary ears. He could hear the stream. He could hear the wind in the high branches. He could hear, 2 minutes ago, the faint tear of cloth against bramble that meant she had reached the deer track. He had heard her step into the water and not come out again on the other side, and his chest had loosened by exactly one breath, because that meant she had not panicked. That meant she was thinking. That meant she was the same girl she had been at 11, the one who had pressed her hand to his muzzle and said, "Shh." He could hear the howls. He could read them. The first howl had been Corbin, his youngest warrior, the one with the most to prove. The second had been Edith's son, Merrick, eager and clumsy. The third and fourth had been the older two, Duran and Ash, more careful, more dangerous. Duran was the one to worry about. Duran did not run hot. Duran would not be fooled by garlic. Yoren would think his way through the false trail in less time than she could climb. Kane sat on his horse and felt every muscle in his back lock into stone. His wolf was past growling now. His wolf was a low, continuous song behind his ribs, a song without words, the kind a wolf sings to a thing that is its own. He wanted to shift. He wanted to go in. He wanted to find Joran and put him on the ground by the throat and tell the rest of his warriors that this hunt was done, and the law could have his crown if it wanted it. He did not move. He did not move because he had been raised, since he was a boy in his father's hall, on one single principle. The law that protects everyone protects no one if a king can break it for love. If he stepped off the line, he saved her today. If he sat on the line, he saved her forever. Untouchable. Unmarriageable against her will. Beyond Briar's reach. Beyond his own reach. Beyond any reach. He sat and his hands stayed flat on his thighs. He sat and he listened to her run. A small page boy in southern livery, perhaps 8 years old, had crept up to the line of stones at his horse's feet, drawn the way small things are drawn to large, still ones. The boy was holding a wooden carving, a clumsy little wolf, the kind a child whittles with a borrowed knife. He stared up at Kane with enormous, unafraid eyes. "The wolf is supposed to win," the boy said, very quietly, as if confiding. "That's how the song goes. My Nan sings it. The wolf is supposed to win." Kane looked down at him. He was not allowed to speak about the hunt. He was allowed to speak about a song. "The wolf wins," he said, low and rough, in the voice he had not used out loud since dawn. "But not the way you think." The boy thought about that. He nodded slowly, the way children nod when they have decided to keep a secret for a stranger. Then he held the carving up. "For luck," the boy said, and tucked it into the top of Kane's boot, and ran off toward the kitchens before any adult could scold him for it. Kane did not move his foot. He did not look down at the carving, but his hand, where it rested on his thigh, opened and closed once, very slowly, like a man remembering how to breathe. Up on the ridge, Lyra reached the standing stones and almost wept. They were taller than she had thought from the dais, 3 of them, lichen-furred and leaning toward each other like old women sharing a secret. Between them, the ground was beaten flat, and at their feet the wind moved differently, in a slow, circling way that smelled of nothing. Old places, old Daryl had said once, holding a hound back from a barrow. Old places eat scent. Don't ask me how, child, but they do. She did not ask how. She walked into the circle of the stones and felt at once that the air there was older than the air outside it. And her own pulse, which had been hammering, slowed by 1 full beat. She crouched against the largest stone and put her back to it and made herself look. From here, she could see down the long slope she had climbed and across to the dais and back into the tangle of forest she had crossed. She saw a flicker of gray moving along the stream. Duran. She saw, further off, a smaller, darker shape angling up the slope toward her. Corbin, she guessed. The young one. The eager one. The one most likely to make a mistake. She took stock. Her shift was torn, soaked at the hem, sticking to her thighs where the cold had numbed them. Her calf was bleeding through the bandage. Her hands were scraped from the oak. She was barefoot, weaponless, and at least 4 hours from sundown. She had no food, no fire, no second skin to throw them off her trail. What she had was the ridge. She had the standing stones, which apparently ate scent. She had a steep slope below her and a steeper one behind. She had wind that moved in circles. She had her brain. She had old Daryl, dead these 3 years, telling her in his patient, smoke-rough voice that there were 2 ways to lose a hound. Outrun it, which no one could, or outthink it, which a child could, if the child was patient. She set herself to be patient. She watched Corbin come up the slope. He was running on 4 legs, but loose, sloppy, casting his nose left and right. He had not yet found the real trail. He was guessing. She let him come. When he was perhaps 30 yards below the ridge, still uncertain, she stood up from behind the stone and waved. Yes, she waved. She lifted her arm and made a wide, slow motion, as if she were calling a dog in from a field, and his head came up at once because movement up high catches a wolf's eye. And he saw her, and he committed. He came up the slope in a straight, charging line, exactly what she needed. She turned and ran, not back into the circle of the stones, but along the ridge to the east, where she had seen, 2 minutes earlier, the lip of an old slate slide. The slope there was nearly vertical for 15 feet, a tumble of loose gray shale, and below it the ground was thick with bracken. She had no plan past this point. She had only the slope. She reached the lip and threw herself down it sideways, half running, half sliding, riding the shale like a board. And behind her, she heard Corbin hit the top of the ridge at full charge and not stop in time. He went over the edge. He did not slide. He fell. She heard the wet animal sound of him hitting the bracken hard, and the shorter, sharper sound of something in him breaking, and then a long, thin whine that meant pain, but not death. She did not look back. She found her feet at the bottom of the slope, staggered through the bracken, and ran. Behind her, Corbin was whining and trying to drag himself upright. Ahead of her, the forest opened into a long, shallow basin, and beyond the basin she could see the silver flash of a larger river. A river. Real water. Wide water. She ran for it. Down at the line, Kane heard the whine and went very still. He knew that voice. Corbin. Hurt, not dead. Off the hunt. One down. He let his eyes close for half a breath. His wolf laughed inside him, a short, pleased huff. Smart girl, his wolf said. Took out the puppy first. Smart, smart girl. The other warriors heard it too. He could tell by the way the howling changed, from triumphant to wary. Euron threw a single low note that meant regroup, and Merrick answered it. And Ash answered last, slower, from further off than Cain had expected. So Ash had gone wide. Ash was thinking. Ash was the second danger, and Ash was now somewhere Cain could not place. He hated this. He hated sitting. He hated the small wooden wolf in his boot pressing against his ankle like an accusation. The afternoon light had begun to slant. They were not yet halfway through the day. He thought about his father, dead 12 years now, and what his father would have said about a king who sat on the line while a woman he could not stop calling mine ran for her life through woods full of his own warriors. His father would have said, "That is exactly what a king does." His father would have said, "The law is the only thing that makes you better than the wolves who made you." His father would also have said, very quietly, after, "And I am sorry, my son. I am sorry that being better costs what it costs." Cain sat on his horse and let the cost happen. Lyra reached the river. She waded into her waist before the current took her, and she let it. She let the river carry her 200 yards downstream while she kicked toward the far bank, and when her feet finally caught on stones again, she crawled out shaking and sat on the gravel for 10 ragged breaths, because her body simply would not run any further until she let it have those breaths. She looked at the sky. The sun was past its peak. Maybe 2 hours of light left, maybe less. She got up. She kept moving. Behind her, somewhere upstream, she heard Joran's howl take on a new pitch, the pitch of a wolf who has lost the trail entirely and is angry about it. She allowed herself, for 1 second, a small, grim grin. Then she ran on. The light began to thin. It was the kind of thinning that promises an end without yet delivering it. The long gray-gold hour before sundown, when the air goes soft and the shadows go long, and a frightened animal believes for a moment that it might live. Lyra did not let herself believe it. Old Daryl had warned her about that too. The hour before dusk, child, is when the prey relaxes. That is when the smart hounds catch them. Don't relax. Don't relax until your back is to a wall and the lamp is lit. She did not relax. She moved through the lower forest at a steady half-jog, keeping to the wettest ground she could find, leaving as little of herself behind as possible. She had stopped bleeding at the calf. Her feet were so cold she could not feel where the cuts ended and the soles began. Her shift was rags. Her hair had come loose entirely and was full of leaves and burrs, and somewhere along the river, she had lost the silver pin Briar had set in it that morning, a pin that had cost more than Lyra had ever held in her hand. She found that she did not care about the pin. She did not care about Briar. She did not, she realized with a small, clear inward shock, even care about being clean. She cared about the line of stones at the forest's edge, and the bell that would ring at sundown, and the question of whether she would be on the right side of those stones when it did. She thought, with a kind of bitter humor that surprised her, that if she lived through this, she would never again be afraid of a chamberlain. She pushed on. 3 down by her count. She had not seen Merrick for over an hour, but she had heard him cross her trail twice and lose it both times. And the second time he had howled with a frustration so personal, it almost made her feel sorry for him. Joran was the one she had not pinned. Joran was somewhere ahead of her, or behind her, or above her, and she did not know which, and that was the problem with Joran. Ash she had pinned. Ash had gone wide. Ash had cut north along the river to head her off at the narrow ford, and she had seen him from a stand of alders, slim and pale and silent, moving like a thought across the bank, and she had immediately turned south instead. Ash was still hunting her. He just was not where he thought she was. That left Joran. The light thinned further. The sky above the canopy went from gold to honey to the deep peach that meant the sun was almost touching the western ridge. She could not see the ridge from down here, but she could feel it, the way one feels the cooling of a forge. She had perhaps a quarter of an hour. She had to get back to the line. The line was south and east of where she now stood, and between her and it was a thicket of thorn and a long open meadow that she had been avoiding all day because it offered no cover. She would have to cross the meadow. There was no other route that brought her back to the stones in time. She crouched at the edge of the meadow and looked across it. It was perhaps 100 yards of open grass, gold in the slanting light, with a single oak in the middle that had been struck by lightning some years past and stood as a black charred finger. Beyond it, the dark line of the trees that she had run out of this morning. Beyond those, the dais. She did not see Jorn. That was the problem. She did not see him, which meant he was either very far off or very close. She thought about it for 10 seconds. 10 seconds was all she had. Then she stepped out of the thicket and ran. He came out of the long grass. Of course he did. He had been lying in the grass the whole time, downwind, perfectly still, in the one place she had not thought to look because she had not believed any wolf would have the patience for it. Jorn had the patience. Jorn rose up out of the grass like a gray wave when she was 30 yards in, and it came at her low and fast and silent. No howl, no warning, the way old wolves take elk. She had a second. She used it. She did not run for the trees. She would not make the trees, and she knew it. She ran for the lightning oak. She reached it half a stride before he reached her, and she did the only thing left to do, which was throw herself behind the trunk, put her back against the charred wood, and grab the only weapon the meadow had given her. A long, splintered branch the lightning had broken off and left lying in the grass at the oak's foot. It was almost as tall as she was, jagged at one end where the wood had torn. She came up from the ground with it in both hands like a spear. Jorn skidded around the trunk, jaws wide, and ran himself onto it. Not all the way. She did not have the strength for that, but the splintered end caught him in the soft place under the jaw, and his own momentum drove the wood 3 inches into him, and he yelped, an astonished, almost human yelp, and recoiled, twisting his head, ripping the branch out of her hands and out of himself in the same motion. He landed a yard from her, bleeding, snarling, real fury in his eyes now. And she had no weapon left, and the meadow was very wide. And then something inside her chest, something she had felt all day as a small, high singing she had been ignoring opened. It was as if a door she had not known was there had been kicked off its hinges. The singing in her chest became a roar. Heat moved up her arms in a fast, rushing line. Not the burn of a fire, but the warm pour of sunlight through window glass, and her hands, her scraped, mud-streaked, bleeding hands, flooded with a soft, white gold light that was not flame and not lamplight and not anything she had ever seen before. She had time to think, oh. She had time to think, oh, so this is what they meant. Then Jorn lunged again, and she lifted her hands without knowing why, and the light went out of her in a wave, and it hit him not like fire, but like a great, soft palm. And he was knocked backwards across the meadow, and rolled twice, and came up shaking his head with his ears flat and a stunned, wounded look in his eyes. And he did not come at her again. He turned. He ran. He ran in a straight line away from her, low to the ground, and his howl as he ran was not a hunting howl. It was a howl of, I yield. It was a howl every wolf in the forest understood, and Cain, on his horse a quarter-mile away, heard it and felt his whole body go loose for the first time since dawn. Lyra stood in the meadow with light still pouring from her palms, and looked down at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. The light was already fading. She could feel her knees trying to give. She did not let them. She walked. She walked the rest of the meadow on legs that were not entirely her own. And she walked into the trees, and she walked the long path between the trees that led back to the line of stones. And somewhere behind her in the gathering dusk, a fourth howl rose. Ash this time, also yielding, also withdrawing. And Merrick's followed a moment later, smaller and shamefaced. And there was no wolf at all in the woods now between her and the line. And she walked, and the bell at the edge of the forest began to toll. She came out of the trees at the last toll. The sun was just touching the western ridge, a sliver of red light bleeding across the sky, and the courtyard had filled again, drawn back by the sound of the bell and by some message run from warrior to warrior, that the hunt was over and done in a way no one had expected. The southern lords were on the dais. Briar was on the dais. The chamberlain was on the dais with his book open and his mouth open, and Cain was on the line. He had not moved all day. His horse stood where it had stood at dawn. His hands were flat on his thighs. The small wooden wolf the page boy had given him was still tucked into the top of his boot. He saw her come out of the trees, and his whole face did not change, which was, for him, an expression so violent that Joran, who had limped back to the line 10 minutes earlier and was sitting in human shape with a strip of cloth pressed to his throat, looked at his king once, and then looked very firmly at the ground. Lyra stepped over the line of stones. There was no sound in the courtyard at all. Then the bell tolled the final time, marking sundown, and the chamberlain, in a voice that wavered like a candle, read out the old words. The words that meant the offering had not been taken. The words that meant the forest had chosen. The words that meant she stood now under a protection older than any house in any kingdom. Briar's face went the color of skimmed milk. Lyra looked at her stepmother across the long stretch of stones for the first time since dawn. She did not smile. She did not have to. Briar's hand had gone to her own throat, as if she could feel a noose tightening there. And perhaps she could, because the chamberlain was still reading, and the words he was reading, in the old tongue, were words Briar had heard in her cradle and ignored as relics. And he was getting to the part about the forest-chosen being, beyond the contracts and dispositions of any household, including those of guardians, including those of stepmothers. And Briar was beginning, very slowly, to understand that she had not just lost a sacrificial pawn. She had lost her hold. Lyra looked away from her. She looked at Cain. He had dismounted finally, now that the law allowed it. He stood at the line of stones with his hands open at his sides and his head lowered slightly, and she realized, with a strange swimming feeling in her ribs, that he was not approaching her. He was waiting for her to approach him, if she chose. He did not assume. He stood there, the Alpha King of Blackthorn, the man whose name had been used to frighten her since she was a child, and he waited for a barefoot kennel girl to decide whether to walk over. She walked over. She did not know why. She walked because her legs would carry her 10 more steps and no further, and because the only solid thing in her field of vision was him. She crossed the space between the stones and the horse, and when she got close enough, she saw that his eyes were not the eyes she had expected. They were not yellow. They were gray, like winter water, and they were wet. He did not touch her. He did not reach for her. He said, very quietly, in a voice that was rougher than the one she had imagined him having, "You ate garlic." She blinked at him. "The least clever among my warriors got a noseful of it and lost you for an hour," he said.
That was good.
She felt something in her face want to laugh, which was absurd, because she had nearly died 9 times today and was standing in front of the man people called the Beast of Blackthorn, and he was complimenting her field craft. The laugh did not come out as a laugh. It came out as a single dry sound that might have been a sob. He saw it, and his hand twitched at his side, and he did not lift it. "May I?" he said. She did not understand what he was asking. He clarified. "May I put my coat on you? Your shift is wet and you are shaking, and I will not touch you without your word." She stared at him. He stared back.
No.
Behind him, somewhere on the dais, Briar was making a noise of protest that was being efficiently silenced by other nobles who had finally understood what the Chamberlain had read aloud. The world was very quiet around the question he had asked. Lyra said yes. He took off his coat, the long black wool one with the silver clasps, and he set it around her shoulders without his fingers ever brushing her skin. And the coat was so warm from his body that she made a small involuntary sound against it. Then he said, also quietly,
You must leave.
"I have a thing to tell you, but not here." She nodded. She did not have words. He turned to his warriors and said, in a voice that was suddenly the king's voice and not the man's, "We ride at dawn." All 4 of them flinched. Joran, his throat bandaged, lifted his head and met his king's eyes and said, "My king, we dishonored."
And the answer?
King looked at him for a long moment. "You hunted as you were sworn to hunt," he said. "You hunted well.
Guilty.
You lost. Be glad you lost." Joran, who was perhaps not a fool after all, bowed his head. Then Cain turned back to Lyra and said, "The offering is fulfilled. The forest is chosen. By every law I am sworn to, you are now free of every claim ever made on you. Including," he added, with a small, grim look toward the dais, "hers." Lyra did not look at Briar. She did not need to.
Where will I go?
She said, "Where will I go?" Cain was silent for a beat. He said, "Anywhere you wish." "Including," he said, more carefully, "north, with my pack, as a guest, under my hand, until you decide. No claim, no bond,
You are not alone.
a roof, a room, a door that locks from your side. The choice is wholly yours." She thought about it. The thinking took her perhaps 4 breaths. Then she said, "Yes,
Yes.
north." He closed his eyes for 1 breath, only 1, and when he opened them, he said, "Thank you." He lifted her up onto his horse himself because she could not have climbed. He did not get up behind her. He led the horse. He walked out of the courtyard of House Aldermere with the reins in his hand and the kennel girl on the saddle wrapped in his coat, and the southern court parted before them in absolute silence. And Briar stood on the dais, with her hand still at her throat, and watched them go. And the page boy with the wooden carvings ran along the wall to wave at them as they passed. And Lyra, half fainting in the saddle, lifted her hand and waved back. The journey north took 11 days. Cain did not ride beside her on the first 3. He rode ahead at the front of his column, where he could be seen by his warriors and not seen by her, because he had not entirely trusted his own face in those first 3 days, and he was not the kind of man who allowed his face to rule him. He gave her a wagon and a brown-haired woman called Lorraine, who was the camp's healer and who had a brisk, kind, no-nonsense way about her. And on the second night, when Lyra woke screaming from a dream of teeth in her calf, Lorraine sat with her until the screaming became crying, and the crying became the slow, dry, exhausted breathing of someone who had finally allowed herself to feel what had happened to her. Lorraine did not ask questions. Lorraine made tea. She also produced, on the 3rd morning, a pair of sturdy leather boots that fit, a wool dress in a soft moss green that fit, a comb, a clean shift, and a small wooden box containing salve for the cuts on her feet. Lyra wept silently into the boots for 10 minutes before she put them on. She had not had a pair of shoes that fit her since she was 9. On the 4th day, Cain fell back to ride beside the wagon. He did it the way he had done everything else since the line of stones, which was carefully, with stated permission. "May I ride alongside?" he said from the edge of the road, and Lyra looked at him from under the wagon's awning and said yes. They rode for an hour without speaking. The land had begun to rise. The trees were thicker, darker, older. The air smelled different up here, sharper, with a thread of wood smoke under it. He said, eventually, "You should know something." She said, "I think I already know one thing." He glanced at her. She said,
You shouldn't be here.
"You are the wolf." She had been thinking about it for 4 days. She had been thinking about the way he sat his horse, and the way his eyes had been wet at the line of stones, and the way he had said, "You laid garlic," with the smallest possible smile in his voice, like a man being shown a thing he had hoped for. She had been thinking about how, at 11 years old, the wounded wolf in her straw had looked at her with the gray eyes of winter water, and she had been the only one to think those eyes were strange. He did not look surprised. He looked, instead, a little undone, as if he had been waiting for her to say it and had not been sure he would survive her saying it. He said, "Yes."
You are. You're the one from
She
the
said,
stories, aren't you?
"You were 16. He said, "I was 16. She said, "What were you doing in our kennels?" He said,
What were you doing?
"Dying." He said it without flinching. He said, "My father had sent me south on a small mission, a courtesy errand to a vassal house, and I was ambushed 2 miles from your gate by men I later understood were in the pay of a lord who wanted my father dead, and his sons easier to manage. They put silver in me, 3 pieces, and silver does not heal. I crawled for the first lights I could see. The lights happened to be your kennels. I went under the wall because I could fit. I went under the straw because I could not stand. And then a small girl with a torn pinafore lifted the straw and looked at me and put her hand on my muzzle and said, 'Shh,
I know.
you're safe. I won't tell.'
It's really me.
She remembered. She remembered with a clarity that hit her like cold water. She had been dressed in the pinafore because Briar had not yet decided that pinafores were too good for her. She had said exactly those words. She had believed them because she had been 11 and grieving and had needed something in the world to be safe. She had also stolen scraps for 9 nights and clean water and a heel of stolen bread. And she had pulled the silver pieces out of him on the 2nd night with her own fingers because she had seen the kennel master pull a thorn from a hound's paw and had assumed it worked the same. He told her now very quietly that it had, that 2 of the 3 pieces had come out clean, that the 3rd had been too deep, and she had cried over it and bandaged him instead, and that bandage had held the wound until his body had been able to push the silver out on its own 4 days later on the road home, by which time he was strong enough to shift back to a man and walk into his own city. "Without you," he said, "I would have died in your straw, and the Lord who paid for the silver would have had my brothers next, and my father, and our pack. Without you, I would not be a king. There would be no Blackthorn pack as it is now. There would be a different one, with a different ruler, who would not have ridden south for the hunt offering this year, and you would not have been chosen by the forest, and you would still be in the kennels. So I have spent 6 years," he said, "looking." She said, "Looking for what?" He said, "Looking for the scent." She said, "You did not know my name." He said, "No, I knew the smell of you." 11-year-old hands and barley straw, and the grease the kennelmen put on hounds' pads in winter. I knew it the way I know my own teeth. I have ridden through every southern town between my hall and the sea, hoping I would catch it on a market day. I never did. And then this year, your stepmother walked you into the courtyard, and the wind came east, and I, he said, was not prepared. Lyra was crying again, in the slow, steady way she had not cried since her father died. She wiped her face on the sleeve of the moss-green dress and said, "You sat there all day." He said, "Yes." She said, "You sat there all day knowing it was me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the law that protects you is older than I am, and if I had broken it for you today, I could not have protected you tomorrow. The forest gives you a freedom no king can give. I will not take from you what I cannot give back." Lyra was quiet for a while. The wagon creaked. A small boy from the column, perhaps 7, ran along the verge of the road with a half-grown spotted pup on a length of twine, both of them tumbling and yipping. The pup saw the wagon and made for it, towing the boy. Lyra leaned down without thinking and offered her hand, palm up, and the pup snuffled it once and then licked her wrist with the offhand certainty of a creature that knew good when it smelled it. The boy beamed at her. The pup, having decided, flopped onto its back in the dust and offered its belly. Lyra laughed, a real laugh this time, small and surprised. Cain watched her and said nothing. His wolf inside him, which had been very quiet since the line of stones, said softly, "That's it. That's the sound. That's what we rode for." They reached the city of Blackthorn on the 11th day. It was smaller than she had expected and older, and built mostly of dark stone that had been weathered to the color of slate. There were no gates. There were standing stones at the road, the way her ridge had had standing stones, and the air around the stones moved in the same slow circling way. She understood, as the wagon rolled past them, that the city was protected the way her ridge had protected her, and that this had been quietly true all her life, and she had just not known it. She was given a room. The room had a door that locked from her side. It had a window that opened onto a small courtyard, where an old yew tree grew out of a flagstones, and beneath the yew, there was a wooden bench worn smooth by years of sitting. On the bench, on the morning after she arrived, she found a small carved wooden wolf, no bigger than her palm. It had a chip out of one ear. She picked it up and turned it over. There was no note. She did not need one. She put the wolf on her windowsill where she could see it from the bed, and she went down to find him. She found him in the courtyard with his sleeves rolled up, doing something to the brickwork around the well. He was repointing it, badly, with mortar that had clearly been mixed by someone who knew what they were doing in theory, but not in practice. He looked up when she came out. He had a smear of gray across one cheek. He said, before she could speak, "I am not good at this. I started it as something to do with my hands." She said, "You are the king." He said, "I am also a man with hands." He set down the trowel. He looked at her. He did not move toward her. He never moved toward her first, she had noticed. He always waited. She walked across the courtyard and stopped a foot away from him and looked up. He was very tall. She had not let herself notice how tall before. She said, "The wolf on the bench." He said, "I carved one a year. I did not always know who they were for. There are 6 of them. The page boy at your courtyard had one. Lorraine has one. The one on your windowsill is the 7th. She said, "Why 7? He said, "Because I started carving them when I was 16 and recovering from silver in a cave 100 miles north of your house, and I have not stopped." She thought about that. She lifted her hand slowly and put her fingers against the smear of mortar on his cheek and brushed it away. He went absolutely still under her hand, his eyes closed, She felt his pulse jump under his jaw where her thumb was. He said hoarsely, "Lyra." He had not used her name before. He had said offering, and forest chosen, and you. And she had not realized until this moment that he had been holding her name in his mouth for 11 days and not letting it out. She felt her own breath catch. She said, "You can say it." He opened his eyes. He said, "Lyra." He said it as if it were a word he had been afraid to break. She said, "I do not know how to do this." He said, "Neither do I." She said, "In the kennels they told me I was dangerous." He said, "I know. They were wrong." She said, "I had a fit when I was 11. He said, "Your father had been poisoned, and you had seen the woman who poisoned him hold his hand while he died, and tell the household you had done it. That is not a fit. That is a child who was made to carry what an adult should have carried." She felt her eyes sting. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I have had 6 years to investigate House Aldemir. I know more about your stepmother than she knows about herself. She is being arrested today." She blinked. She said, "Today?" He said, "I sent the order 4 days ago. The Southern Court has no further use for her now that the Chamberlain has read out the Forest choice publicly. They are eager to be rid of her. She's being escorted to the High Tribunal in the capital under a charge of conspiracy and murder. Your father's bones will be exhumed. There are records of the apothecary she purchased the substance from. There are witnesses, including old Darrell's nephew, who has been waiting a long time to speak." She took a step back from him without meaning to. Not in fear, in something closer to vertigo. She said, "You did all of that." He said, "I did it because it should have been done 6 years ago. By people who failed you. Not as a courtship, not as a price. You owe me nothing for it. You will not lose your protection if you walk out of this courtyard tonight and never look at me again." He paused. He said, "I would prefer you did not, but you can." She put her hand back against his cheek, this time without the smear of mortar, just her palm against his stubbled skin, and he leaned his face into it, the way the wounded wolf in the kennels had leaned into her small, dirty hand at 11 years old. And she felt, very quietly, the bond inside her chest that had been a faint hum for 11 days settle into something steady and clear, like a tuning fork finding its note. She said, "I am not going to walk out tonight." He said, "All right." She said, "I am also not going to be claimed in a hall full of nobles." He said, "I would never." She said, "I want to know you first." He said, "Please." She said, "I want to be the one who decides." He said, "You are." He said it like a vow. She kissed him. She kissed him in the courtyard with the badly repointed well behind him and the yew tree dropping its little red berries into her hair. And his hands came up at last and cradled her face as if she were a thing he was afraid to bruise. And she felt the bond in her chest go from steady note to chord. And the chord was a thing she had no name for yet, and that was all right, because she would have time. Time was the thing she had been given. Time to know him. Time to be known. The arrests, the trial, the slow, careful unspooling of 6 years of Lady Briar's lies took most of a winter. Lyra did not attend the trial. She had been asked to, formally, and had thought about it for 2 nights, and had said no. Kane had nodded once and said, "Then you do not." She had not been required to look at her stepmother again. Other people whose jobs were to look, had looked, and had recorded what they saw. And at the end of the winter, a letter came north on a tired horse, saying that Lady Briar of House Aldemir had been found guilty of the murder of Lord Aldermere, of the prolonged slander and false imprisonment of his daughter, of conspiracy with 2 minor southern lords for the assassination of the King of Blackthorn 6 years prior, and of attempted murder by means of the hunt offering. The sentence was exile. Lyra had been surprised by that. Briar had expected execution. The chamberlain who read the verdict to her in the High Hall had read also the heroine's request that mercy be shown, on the grounds that Briar had taken one parent from her, and she would not become a person who took parents from anyone, even her enemy. Briar, the messenger reported, had wept. Whether she had wept from gratitude or from rage, no one could say. She was put on a small ship out of a small southern port with a sealed pardon for her life and a sealed banishment for her presence, and she was last seen on the deck, looking back at the receding coast with an expression that no one in the court would describe to Lyra later, even when she asked. Lyra did not push. She had been, she found, more concerned with the small things. She had been concerned, that winter, with learning the ways of the Blackthorn city, with the small, irregular streets of dark stone, with the smell of the wood smoke, with the names of the women who came to the keep with bread and questions and offers of friendship, with the brisk healer Lorraine, who turned out to be also Kane's cousin, and who had once, at 14, broken his nose for an opinion he no longer held. With a small, thin boy called Tobin, who had attached himself to Lyra in the first week and had taken to sitting at her feet whenever she sat down and explaining the city to her in a long, uninterrupted ribbon of small boy chatter. With a half-grown spotted pup, the same one she had met on the road, whose owner had decided she would be happier in the kitchens of the keep, where Lyra could find her at any hour. The pup, who had been called nothing in particular before, was now called Mercy. Mercy slept on Lyra's bed, despite all official arrangements to the contrary. Kane had stopped objecting. Kane had begun, in the mornings, to find a small spotted pup on his foot when he woke, because Mercy had decided, sometime after the New Year, that the king's foot was an acceptable pillow. Lyra always woke before he did in those mornings, and would lie for a long time on her side watching him, the heavy line of his shoulder, the soft, regular movement of his breath, the dark wing of hair across his forehead, and she would think, with a quiet incredulity, that this was her life now, that this was a thing one could have, that sleep, in a room with someone, with a small dog, without fear, was a thing that existed in the world and had been allowed to exist for her. They had been formally bonded in spring. She had chosen the form of it. There had been no public claiming. There had been a small ceremony in the yew courtyard, with Lorraine and Tobin and Mercy and 3 of the older women of the city as witnesses. And Kane had asked her a single question in the old tongue and a single question in the common tongue. And she had answered yes to both. And he had bitten her gently at the place where her shoulder met her throat, and she had bitten him in the same place a moment later, because she had been told the choice was hers, and she had chosen it to be both ways. The bond had bloomed in her chest like a window opening. She could feel him now, faintly, when they were apart. She could feel his moods at the edge of her own moods, the way one feels a fire in a next room. She had learned, slowly, to feel his inner wolf as well, which was a lower, rougher, more constant thing than him, and which was, she had discovered to her amusement, deeply sentimental about her hair. The wolf, when she let it speak in the back of her mind, mostly said her hair, her hair, her hair, in a tone of unembarrassed worship, until she laughed, and Kane, hearing the laugh through the bond, would always smile somewhere across the city, without knowing why. She had, that year, also begun to learn what she was. The light in her hands had not been a fluke. It was a bloodline gift, ancient and northern and largely forgotten, of a line of healer wardens who had once stood against corrupted magic in this very forest. Her mother, who had died in childbirth and whom she had never known, had been the last named carrier. Briar, it turned out, had married Lyra's father, knowing exactly what bloodline he had married into. and the long campaign to convince the household that Lyra was mad had been, in part, a campaign to keep the gift from ever being recognized or trained, because a trained warden would have seen Briar for what she was at a glance. Lyra trained now. She trained quietly, with an old woman of the city called Edith, who had served Kane's grandmother and who knew the old forms. The light came easier the second time. It came easier the third. By midsummer, she could close a wound in a small pup's paw with a single touch, and she had learned to make the light not in panic, but in steadiness, which Edith said was the harder lesson and the one that mattered. She did not speak of it much. She did not want to. The light was a private thing. The keep was a public one. She kept the public face that was needed, and at night she walked in the yew courtyard with her hands cupped around a small pale glow that she let bloom and fade, while Kane sat on the worn bench and watched her and said nothing, because he had learned that some kinds of love were best given as quiet attention. They were happy. It surprised them both. They had each, in their separate ways, expected happiness to be a more dramatic thing, and it turned out instead to be a string of small, ordinary mornings, and a courtyard with a yew tree, and a small spotted dog asleep on a king's foot, and a child's voice in the corridor telling a story to anyone who would listen, and a hand reaching across a table for another hand without looking, finding it without surprise. 2 years later, on a soft autumn afternoon, Lyra sat on the wooden bench under the yew with her hands folded in her lap, and watched a small dark-haired girl of perhaps 18 months pursue a yellow leaf across the flagstones with the unblinking determination of a small predator. The girl was called Aderin, which was an old word for bird. She had, at present, a smudge of dirt on her chin and a leaf in her fist, and a triumphant expression. Mercy, who was no longer young, lay nearby with her chin on her paws, and watched the leaf hunting with the indulgent patience of an ant. Tobin, who was no longer a thin, small boy, and was now a rangy young apprentice in the city smithy, leaned against the courtyard arch and grinned. Lorraine, somewhere inside the keep, was singing a song with words Lyra could almost hear. The yew dropped a single red berry into Aderin's hair, and Aderin, distracted from her leaf, sat down hard on her small bottom and tried to eat the berry. Lyra leaned forward and intercepted her gently. "Not for eating, sweet," she said, prying the berry free of small fingers. "Pretty for looking." Aderin considered this. Aderin was a child of considerable patience for her age, and tended to weigh her options before objecting. She accepted the trade of a smooth, pale pebble from her mother's pocket, and returned to her leaf hunting with the pebble clutched in her free hand. Kane came into the courtyard. He had been out of the city for 2 days, north along the ridge, settling a small dispute between 2 vassal families that had been bubbling for a year, and he was tired in the small, economical way he allowed himself to be tired in front of her. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard and looked, for the count of 3 breaths, at the picture of his wife on the bench and his daughter on the flagstones, and the dog, and the boy, and the yew. Then he came over and sat beside Lyra without speaking, and she leaned her head against his shoulder without speaking, and his hand found hers in her lap, and they sat. Aderin noticed her father after a moment. She made the small, loud, declarative noise that had been her name for him since she could make sounds, which was a noise something like "pa," except more imperious, and she held up her leaf for inspection. Kane considered the leaf with appropriate gravity. He pronounced it a fine leaf. Aderin, satisfied, returned to work. They sat a while longer. The light slanted. Aderin collected 3 more leaves. Mercy snored once and woke herself up and pretended she had not. Eventually, Lyra said, very low, "I have something to tell you." He turned his face to her. He did not ask. He waited. She said, "In spring." He looked at her. He looked at her hand in his, and at her face, and at her belly. which did not yet show because it was very early, and his eyes filled the way they had filled at the line of stones 3 years ago. A single quick, wet brightness that he did not try to hide from her this time. He said, "In spring." She said, "In spring." He said, "Lyra." He said it the way he had said it the first time in the U courtyard, like a word he had been afraid to break. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles. Aderin, sensing that something was happening that involved her parents and not her, marched over with her leaf and demanded inclusion by the simple expedient of climbing into her father's lap and putting the leaf in his other hand. Cain held the leaf and the daughter and the wife's hand and looked very much like a man who had run out of any room in his chest for further feeling. And Lyra watched him and thought, with a clear, quiet joy, that this was the parallel scene. This was the courtyard with the U. This was the well he had badly repointed, which still stood, slightly crooked, behind his shoulder. This was the cord she had not had a name for, 3 years ago, that had become, over time, a name she used every day. Tobin slipped out of the archway tactfully, the way he had been doing for 2 years, whenever a moment seemed to want privacy. Mercy got up, stretched, and came to lay her chin on Lyra's foot.
It's coming down.
The U dropped another red berry. Aderin caught it midair and laughed, the unself-conscious laugh of a child who had never once in her short life been told she was dangerous or half mad or unwanted. And the laugh rang against the dark stones of the courtyard and into the corridors of the keep. And somewhere inside, Lorraine sang the next verse of her song. And far off across the city, a forge bell rang for the end of the working day. King closed his hand around hers. He said very quietly, against the top of Aderin's head, "Thank you." She did not ask for what. She knew. She had known since the line of stones. She had, perhaps, known since she was 11 years old, and pressed her palm against the muzzle of a wounded wolf and said, "Shh, you're safe." There were a few moments in this one that stayed with me, if I'm honest. The page boy with his clumsy carved wolf at the line of stones, the small crushed garlic that confused a young warrior, the lightning oak, and the splintered branch, and a quiet kennel girl deciding she would not die today. I'd love to know which of those landed for you. Until the next story.